Good afternoon. Welcome to UCSF Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, Chair of the Department of Medicine at UCSF. Welcome again to our live audience at UCSF in the department, and to our colleagues as well as our friends at our partner sites in the UCSF Health Network. As is our routine, we will post this video tonight at about 7 o'clock or so on YouTube, and our prior Grand Rounds over the last few months have been viewed over 300,000 times. A few quick ground rules for the live audience are shown here. Put your Zoom window in full screen mode. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. I'll try to get to a few of them. And as I said, we will have this on YouTube later. One of the features of this pandemic is that it requires expertise and insights to understand it, drawn from many disciplines. As I thought back about the last 3 months and some of the guests that we've had here, they've included clinical experts of all kinds of stripes: intensivists, hospitalists, infectious disease doctors, hematologists, pediatricians, geriatricians, as well as epidemiologists, statisticians, clinical trialists, virologists, immunologists, sociologists, experts on healthcare disparities and on race. We've even had a futurist. But one critical perspective that we've missed is that of the historian. In thinking about our current crisis, the most relevant historical precedent occurred outside of any of our lifetimes. It was the 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed more than 20 million people around the world. So I'm really thrilled and privileged to have the opportunity to talk to John Barry, who's a professor at Tulane University and author of the seminal book, The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. If we were a legitimate TV site, the book would come spinning onto the page right now, but I'm going to just go ahead and show it to you. There's my copy, completely dog-eared. The book, which I heartily endorse, is over a decade old, although John recently wrote a new afterword. But despite that, it's currently the best-selling paperback book in the world on the New York Times bestseller list. So it's had a remarkable resurgence as people have tried to better understand our current predicament by looking at the lessons from the past. So let me welcome John Barry to UCSF and to our medical grand rounds. There you are. Hi, John. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I figured we would start mostly discussing the 1918 pandemic, and then later in the hour we will toggle to talk about its relevance for our current situation and some of the really many lessons that it should teach us. So let's start by having you set the scene. What was life like in the United States and maybe around the world in January 1918?
That's too big a question. Well, most of Europe and the United States were at war. That created an atmosphere and an infrastructure in the United States that the pandemic fell into. Most of the rest of the world was carrying on as usual, except for the British Empire. And in terms of the US anyway, the Wilson administration had created something called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee wrote that truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. Nothing in experience tells us that one is superior to the other. Went on to say that all that mattered was the impact of what you said, not whether it was true or false. And that became very important when the pandemic arrived. At the same time, Wilson had some legitimate concerns about the fact that the largest demographic group in the United States was of German descent. Wasn't really confident Americans would fight against Germany. There had been a rebellion in Ireland against British rule. He wasn't confident Irish Americans would fight on the side of Britain. So they passed a law, the Sedition Act, that was upheld by the Supreme Court, that made it punishable by 20 years in jail to utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government in the United States. And that was rigorously prosecuted. And that sort of set the stage for what would happen when the pandemic occurred.
Okay. So that's actually a remarkable thing. The idea of when we first heard the idea of alternative facts or fake news, I think many of us found it jarring and novel, but in fact, it was a historical precedent in 1918.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There was fake news, and it came from the government, and there was largely, in Europe, there was outright censorship in the warring countries. The United States was self-censorship, but that was quite consistent and well executed.
So that's the scene that we're entering the war. We were late entrants to it, and the virus begins somewhere. You make the case that it actually probably began in the Midwest in Kansas.
I did, at the time, I thought some very good reasons to state that. I actually wrote a scientific journal article on that, which got some traction, but in the last 16 years, there's been a lot of epidemiological research. I think Kansas is still a possibility, but my own thinking is probably China. There's a very good virologist, influenza expert, who believes it started in France. Vietnam's another possibility. New York City is also a possibility. So we will probably never know.
You just named a ton of places. I didn't hear the country Spain, and yet this is sometimes called the Spanish flu. How did that happen?
Spanish influenza, it's crystal clear that the disease was well established before it got to Spain. Spain was not at war. Therefore, its press was not censored. The king got sick. A lot of Spaniards got sick. And it became known as Spanish influenza because other countries going on in Spain. In Spain, however, it was called the Naples flu.
Interesting. So I'd love for you to do a brief reading from the book. And as we've lived through surges now in New York City and Italy and China, it felt novel to many of us, including me. We'd never seen anything quite like that, and now we're beginning to see, sadly, similar surges in Texas and Arizona. But I think the book captured the power of what this felt like, as it was really blasting through communities, and particularly in this case, because the war was going on, it really plowed through military bases. So I think you have a reading. Can you tell us a little bit about who Roy Grist was, and then if you could read a short passage to him, that'd be great.
He was a physician at Camp Devens, about 30 miles north of Boston, which was the first Army camp hit by the lethal second wave. The first wave was hit or miss and was actually quite mild. I can go into greater detail if you want later. The second wave was very lethal, much more lethal than COVID-19. And you did ask me to locate that passage, so I have it.
Great.
He's writing a colleague, another physician, and
I think this was about the transport of soldiers from one Army base to another, right, at the time, if I recall.
Okay, these men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of La grippe or influenza. And when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones. And a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from the ears and spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. It is horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die. But to see these poor devils dropping like flies, we've been averaging about 100 deaths per day. Pneumonia means, in about all cases, death. We've lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days, there were no coffins, and the bodies piled up something fierce. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. Goodbye, old pal. God be with you till we meet again.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about the early days of the epidemic. Did people have any sense what this was and what the causative agent was? And you mentioned the first stage was fairly mild.
Right. I'm convinced, and I think the consensus view among virologists is that the first and second waves were the same virus. There are a lot of, but there is a minority who think the difference in virulence was so great they were different viruses. There were medical journal articles during the first wave, which again was hit or miss. For example, Los Angeles didn't have a single influenza death reported in the spring. There were journal articles that said the symptoms are like influenza, it looks and smells like influenza, but not enough people are dying, so it can't be influenza. In July, however, the first indications of a widespread, there were individual small pockets in the spring where there was enough virulence that it suggested what the virus could do. Then in July in Switzerland, there was a widespread lethal outbreak. So much so that U.S. military intelligence reports back from Switzerland said it's being called influenza, but it's actually the Black Death of the Middle Ages. It wasn't the Black Death, it was just influenza.
Yeah.
In fact, the deep cyanosis that I referred to earlier was spreading a lot of rumors about the Black Death. In September, almost simultaneously, it hit Boston and Sierra Leone. It spread pretty rapidly around the world, even without air travel. Possibly in that first wave, which again was largely hit or miss, it may have been seeding itself. Also, possibly it wasn't as good as it got at infecting people. At any rate, that very widespread second wave, people in the United States were being told this is ordinary influenza by another name by national public health leaders. There was no Tony Fauci in 1918. That was consistent with the Wilson administration's effort to focus on the war. They were concerned that any negative news about anything would detract from the war effort. But it was immediately apparent to people that this was not ordinary influenza by another name. There were deaths reported in less than 12 hours from very reliable observers. It clearly happened, certainly a minority of instances, but definitely happened. Some of the symptoms, not just the cyanosis, but where we have good data from Army bases, 15% of the soldiers bled from the nose. There were also reports of very, highly credible reports, people bleeding from their eyes and ears and mouths. So these are pretty terrifying symptoms, certainly for lay people, and not too reassuring for healthcare professionals either. Yeah. So with symptoms like that, with rapid deaths, with high number of deaths, with, as this audience probably knows, the target demographic was adults from 18 to 45. Probably close to 2/3 of the dead were in that age bracket. With all these things happening, people practically overnight recognized that this was not ordinary influenza by another name, no matter how many times they were told that.
So it's interesting that this sort of it's just the flu thing. Again, that was
Right.
that was ongoing in 1918 as well. People sort of downplaying the severity of it, and it's just like the flu. I can
For
tell
very
you,
different reasons, of course.
yeah, I can tell you as a physician, we're not all that fond of blood coming out of the nose or ears either. It's not just a layperson thing. You mentioned that one of the things that was different was that it tended to strike with particular virulence in younger people. Were older people spared, and do you have any sense of why that was? That obviously is quite different from COVID, where the toll is much greater in older people.
Well, the most obvious explanation is that it's a very similar virus with very little lethality, since it was not recognized contemporaneously. Sometime earlier in the 1800s, exposed older people and gave them significant protection. Well over 90% of the excess mortality was people under 65 years old. So that's pretty extraordinary for influenza. Although actually that was quite typical of the 2009 pandemic as well.
Yeah. Want to talk a little bit about science and interesting in your choice of, I've written a few books myself, and you've got to make some big design decisions about what the book is about and what's the core of it and what surrounds it. And it struck me that you chose to have the pandemic be at the core of the book, but very much surrounded by the story of science at the time and
Right.
where science was and how scientists and physicians reacted to the pandemic, and then what happened afterwards, how the pandemic influenced the course of science. So first of all, just ask a kind of writerly question. Why did you choose to do that, to focus so much on the scientific context as opposed to just the pandemic itself?
Well, I didn't like to write books about, just death and destruction, or blood and gore and so forth. That frankly doesn't interest me intellectually. But more importantly, I may be the only person who sees it this way. But if you look at all my books, I think I write about power and the people who have some power to affect the course of events, or at least think they do. And in the case of a pandemic, that's clearly the scientific community. Obviously, politics plays into that significantly, as we unfortunately are learning or relearning. In addition, I always had a very strong interest in science. I almost became a scientist. The only two things I ever wanted to do was medical research and write. So in this book, they kind of came together.
So take us through a little bit of what was the state of science and medicine prior to the pandemic, and maybe introduce us a little bit to William Welch and his meaning. He sort of comes as a key figure in the book.
Right. Welch was dean of the Hopkins, the first dean, founding dean of the Hopkins School of Medicine, and easily, I think, the most important person in the history of American medicine. Arguably the most important person in the history of American science. The medical education in the 19th century was deficient, is a gross understatement. In the United States, it was easily the worst in the world. Faculty was paid entirely by student fee tuition in almost every medical school. So there are people who had no college background, in some cases didn't get out of high school, who, as long as their check cleared the bank, they could become doctors. Even at Harvard, in places like Harvard and Columbia, 20 years after Pasteur started his work and was well publicized for his achievements, Harvard and Columbia didn't have anybody who knew how to use a microscope, nor was a microscope part of the equipment. At Harvard, you could fail 4 of 9 courses and still get an MD. Hopkins, as Welch said, the results were better than the system because many motivated physicians went to Europe for training, including Welch, who studied in the best laboratories in Europe and primarily in Germany. And Hopkins was founded on the German model to bring science to America, really, in its educational system. And the medical school set all sorts of standards that students had to meet. And it essentially forced the other medical schools to compete with them. In addition, in 1910, there was something called the Flexner Report, which was a muckraking report about just how bad American medical education was. And it was horrific in many cases. Very few medical schools did students, even as late as 1910, they never examined a patient. Everything was a lecture course. And some places didn't even have skeletons. didn't perform autopsies. So roughly half of American medical schools closed or merged within 3 or 4 years after the Flexner report came out. Very dramatic. So Welsh was the leader. He wasn't the only person, but he was the leader in making American medicine scientific and improving the medical school education. Right now, there is no bad American medical schools. Some may be better than others, but they all meet the minimum standards are pretty good, and they all meet the minimum standards. There are other figures in the book of great consequence. And these people did not have the knowledge we have, obviously, but they're every bit as good as scientists. One of the characters in the book, Paul Lewis, proved that polio was a viral disease. And I think it was 1905 or I forgot the exact year. And 2 years later, he developed a vaccine 100% effective in protecting monkeys. Oswald Avery, one of my favorite figures in the book, probably the single person most deserving of a Nobel Prize who never got one, in a sense created the entire field of molecular biology. He was being considered for the Nobel Prize for his lifetime contribution to immunology when he wrote an article in 1944 that said DNA carried the genetic code. This was very controversial at the time. And they didn't give him the prize for his immunological work because they weren't sure he was right about DNA. And of course, he was right about DNA. Yeah. So in the book, I quote Jim Watson and Salvador Luria and half a dozen Ola McFarlane Burnett, half a dozen other Nobel laureates, all giving extraordinary credit to Avery for pointing them in the right direction. Avery also developed an anti-pneumococcal vaccine. I think what you get today is a straight line descendant of that. He did that during the pandemic. Even his work on DNA was an outgrowth of his work on the pneumococcus, which was determined by the pandemic. With this audience, you all know the saying, basic science, you shoot an arrow into the air and wherever it lands, you paint the target. Probably all familiar with that comment or saying, whatever it is, and so forth. So these were terrific scientists. And incidentally, when I said Lewis proved polio was a viral disease, in 1918, they knew that there were these very small organisms that pass through filters. They called them filterable viruses. But they didn't know if they were just bacteria and behaved like bacteria and just very, very small, or whether they were a different kind of organism. That definition came out of research in the pandemic by a guy named Thomas Rivers, and didn't come till 1925.
And it sounds like during the pandemic, there was, because of the frequency of secondary bacterial infections, there were many people who thought that was the culprit.
Absolutely. In fact, Haemophilus influenza still carries the name. Richard Pfeiffer, a German who's a Robert Koch protege, in the 1889 pandemic, believed that he had identified the pathogen and gave it the name H. flu. It was also known as Pfeiffer's bacillus. Obviously, it still carries the name, but just as obviously, it was not the pathogen. So there were a lot of vaccines that were developed against bacterial targets. If someone happened to be attacked by a secondary bacterial pneumonia with that bacteria, those vaccines would work, like Avery's anti-pneumococcal vaccine. But obviously, they weren't any good against the influenza virus.
Yeah. So let's switch a little bit to the politics. We have learned in the last 6 months the importance of the political response to the pandemic, and is there trying to figure out, are there ways of unifying people and getting the facts out there and science out there? And you already mentioned that that didn't go well in 1918. So why? I mean, reading that Wilson never mentioned the pandemic during his presidency, that was pretty shocking. It didn't seem like a dumb guy. So what was he thinking?
Oh, Wilson was brilliant, but he's also an obsessive person. Not my favorite president by any stretch for a lot of reasons. very capable, but his focus was the war, period. That was it. And he was one of these people, you're for him or against him. And just every fiber of his being was entirely focused on the war. For example, when he was advised to stop sending troop ships to Europe during the pandemic because so many soldiers were dying in those incredibly cramped quarters, his response was, well, if they launched a charge into machine guns, they'd die too. So it's the risks they take for being a soldier. Keep sending them. Oddly enough, he was also advised that in camps where influenza had already passed through the camp, then there was immunity, and at least rearrange the schedule of shipping soldiers to Europe, and he wouldn't even do that. So that entire focus on the war consumed him and consumed his administration. Oddly enough, it did not consume the Army, at least the Army medical staff, because practically every, I'm overstating when I say every, but a very large proportion of the leading scientists in the country and physicians were incorporated into the Army. William Welsh became a colonel, who the entire Rockefeller, now Rockefeller University, then Rockefeller Institute, was incorporated lock, stock, and barrel into the Army. They all became officers except for Avery, who was a Canadian. They made him a corporal. Kind of ironic. And so the Army, some of the best science in the country was being done by people in the Army. It's very good work.
So as you think about what Wilson's role in this, was it, sort of the historical parallels I'm thinking of, obviously, are Trump, but also Reagan in the early years of the AIDS epidemic. Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until, many tens of thousands of people had died. That largely was up until Rock Hudson, right? And that was largely because of the group that was being struck by AIDS and the politics of that. Whereas our current president is speaking a lot about about this, just much of it is not accurate. Were other things coming out of the Wilson administration that were wrong, or was it just inattention and silence?
Well, it was primarily silence from the White House. We did have a Surgeon General who did eventually urge bans on public meetings and so forth and so on. But that was, the pandemic was well established nationally by the time he uttered that. Prior to that, he was saying things like, you have nothing to fear if ordinary precautions are taken. And again, this is ordinary influenza by another name. The decisions were all made, not even statewide as they are now, but city by city. And in most places, those national lines were echoed. And the disconnect between the experience people were having, again, nobody in 1918 was saying this is a hoax. It was too virulent, too many people were dying too horribly. But even as this was going forward, people are being reassured. For example, in Philadelphia, when they one of the hardest hit cities in the country, when they finally, belatedly, closed schools, banned church services, closed theaters, and so forth and so on, one of the newspapers actually said, this is not a public health measure. You have no cause for alarm. I mean, how stupid did they think people were? Yeah. The only thing that caused it wasn't reassurance. It was counterproductive. People realized they couldn't believe anything they were being told. And this only created more fear. And in some cases, panic. And in the worst situations, maybe sort of fraying, even a dissolution of society. Victor Vaughn, who had been dean of the University of Michigan Medical School before the war, a very important figure in American medicine, and in the Army, he was a colonel, head of communicable diseases for the Army. He wrote in his own hand right at the peak of the pandemic, if this continues its current rate of acceleration for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. So that's how bad it got, or was on the verge of becoming.
Yeah.
But he happened to write that right at the peak, and things started to get better.
And you think that, and the motivation, as far as you could reconstruct from Wilson, was he's not a stupid guy. He saw what was going on, but he thought having a absolutely singular focus on the war was the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned Philadelphia, so tell us the story of the Liberty Parade.
Well, there were, on September 28th, there were parades throughout the country scheduled to raise money for the Liberty loans, war bonds, sale bonds. But in Philadelphia, influenza was already well established, although not obviously so. But in the medical community, they all recognized it. They urged the cancellation of this parade. It was one of the most corrupt cities in the country. The mayor, in the middle of the pandemic, was indicted not for standard corruption, but for accessory to murder. This guy was a thug. he had other things to worry about.
Yeah.
And the public health commissioner was a perfectly decent guy, but didn't have the guts to stand up to the political machine. And the parade went forward. You had several 100,000 people crowded close together, shouting, singing Liberty songs. Was part of it was a community spirit. You all sing along, you all pressed close together to get to see the parade close to the street. And, incubation period for influenza is 24 to 96 hours. And, like clockwork, in the next few days, influenza just exploded across the city.
Yeah. I can imagine as you saw, we're having a big political rally, and in Oklahoma, I assume there was some resonance there as you've heard stories like that.
Too much resonance for, again, different reasons. You could argue that, we're at war, Wilson had some justification, but now you have only incompetence and stupidity.
Yeah, yeah. After one of the most vivid passages in the book was in Philadelphia, maybe after the parade. You talked about people hanging crepe on the fronts of their house. So tell us about what was that about? Well,
of course, that death, and there are some pretty moving stories from Philadelphia. I said at the beginning that I don't like to write about blood and gore. That doesn't interest me intellectually, but there is some of that in the book. It's,
incredibly poignant. It was that people hung it to demonstrate that someone had died and was still in the house and essentially waiting for a truck to come and pick up the bodies and cart them away.
In Philadelphia, you literally had priests driving horse-drawn carts through the streets, calling upon people to bring out their dead. There were mass graves. Almost every city ran out of coffins. They were reusing coffins in funerals. They'd have a service, very small service, with someone in a coffin, and they'd bury him and reuse the coffin for another service. There was, one story, speaking about Philadelphia, that moved me of a child, and the mother pleaded with them not to take the child, just the body. They at least put him in a macaroni box, which was a large box, large enough for the child. She ran to get a macaroni box to put the kid in. In fact, I think Carter Metcher and Richard Hatchett for this number, but they computed in terms of children under the age of 5, they died at a rate equal to all-cause deaths today for a period of 23 years for children under the age of 5 in 1918. So,
extraordinary.
Pretty horrific number.
I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in. One of the people who's watching said, "Did Wilson's stroke and health status significantly affect his second administration?" And you make the point that it's not clear that he actually had a stroke. He may have had a neurological impact from the virus. So can you take us through kind of what happened to Wilson?
Well, I think it's crystal clear that it's just as we're finding out with COVID-19, and the pathology of COVID-19 is remarkably similar to what was going on in 1918, from the cytokine storm to infect, almost every organ. But crystal clear, in 1918, that virus had did a lot of neurological damage. According to comprehensive reviews after the pandemic, it was second only to pulmonary. I could go into great detail, but don't want to take the time. Wilson had influenza in the middle of Versailles Peace Conference, 103-degree fever, all sorts of other standard symptoms for the 1918 virus. One of his party, a young man, died. Several other members of the U.S. peace delegation were sick. Without question, he had influenza. Everybody commented, from the White House usher to Herbert Hoover to the British Prime Minister Lloyd George. Everybody commented about how disoriented he was, physically weak. Before he was sick, he insisted upon the principles upon which America had entered the war, a peace without victory. And he negotiated with Clemenceau, the French PM, whose nickname was the Tiger, negotiated with Clemenceau while he was still in his sickbed. And he caved in on basically everything that he said America had ended the war over. John Maynard Keynes called him the greatest fraud on earth. Wilson himself said, if I were German, I'm not sure I'd sign this peace treaty. You can't prove that he wouldn't do the same thing, wouldn't have done the same thing if he had not had influenza. But we do know without question he had influenza. It was not a stroke. The later stroke that he did have was much more likely related to the influenza he suffered from than the other way around. At any rate, we know he did have flu. He was mentally disoriented, unable to even remember what had occurred a few hours earlier. He did cave in. Maybe would have done it anyway, but.
And of course, people have made the point that there's some connection between the agreements at the end of World War I and potentially the rise of Hitler.
Right. Historians are essentially unanimous on the point that peace treaty contributed significantly to the rise of the Nazis in Germany.
So one of our viewers asked, what did they know about mass quarantines, and maybe more generally speak about, what could they do at the time in terms of medications? There were no ICUs, there was no mechanical ventilation.
Right.
So what tools did they have, and what did they try that didn't work, and what turned out to work?
Well, basically nothing worked unless you were lucky enough to get a vaccine designed against a particular bacteria and you happen to be infected with the bacterial pneumonia. That they tried things like convalescent serum. Some pretty good scientists who happen to be in the Navy, which was not particularly effective, as it turns out. There are even reports of somebody who actually gave hydrogen peroxide IV to some patients. Half of them recovered, half of them died.
Better than Clorox, I guess.
I guess.
Only just.
But he this is in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. He's claiming success because half of his patients recovered.
Wow.
So everything was tried. Obviously, as you said, no ICU beds. You only had supportive care, but that was much less than what you have today with supportive care with ECMO and everything else, if you're fortunate enough to be in a place.
Did they even have oxygen? Did they, if someone?
They did have oxygen, but that was not widely available. And they weren't really great at administering it. So there was very little other than, keeping people hydrated and things like that.
Yeah. And then in terms of preventing.
In terms of masks.
Yeah, masks preventing spread.
Get back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Masks were very widespread usage of masks. There was, and the hand washing and the ventilation and, the same public, stay away from crowds and so forth, the same non-pharmaceutical interventions that we're using today. When the Bush administration launched its pandemic preparedness initiative, I was, part of the early group sort of conceptualizing what the NPIs would be recommended and so forth. And there were studies of cities in 1918, which concluded that, cities that intervened with closing orders earlier rather than later had at least a flatter curve, even though as a general rule, they had the same morbidity. And there was resistance to masks, particularly when, many cities closed, reopened, decided they'd reopen too soon. The pandemics came back and they tried to close a second time, and in some cases a third time. The second time around, there was a lot of resistance to masks. First time around, people accepted it. Obviously, they could see how lethal the disease was. There was no partisanship. There was, the business community certainly resisted, particularly the bars and the theaters and so forth. Many big cities were run by political machines, pretty corrupt machines, and those businesses had pretty powerful influence on those cities. New York City, just Tammany Hall, one of the most corrupt machines in American political history, had just retaken control of New York City. And they put in charge of what had been one of, if not the best, city health departments in the world. Someone who wasn't even an MD, he was a homeopath. New York City did next to nothing for the pandemic. They didn't close anything. And they did not have a particularly bad outcome. 33,000 deaths on a per capita basis was actually not bad in that pandemic. I think the reason was that they had a pretty well-defined spring outbreak. It's crystal clear. In fact, with some co-authors from NIH, I did write a scientific JID article demonstrating that first wave exposure gave very significant immunity to the second wave, up to 89% protection, which is much better than any vaccine we've ever developed against influenza.
So I want to spend the last bit of time talking about sort of the lessons for today, but maybe before we finish this segment, sort of can you give us by the numbers, sort of the overall toll, how many people died around the world, how many people we think died in the United States, those sort of things?
Well, worldwide, you started out saying more than 20 million. That number actually goes back to a 1927 study, which used the number 21.7 million. And that sort of got stuck in the press for decades. But that death toll came about from extrapolating the case mortality from the West, where we had reasonably decent statistics, to the rest of the world. And it turns out the rest of the world had much greater lethality. McFarland Burnett, the Nobel laureate, was the first person I know of to suggest it was 50 to 100 million was the real death toll. Modern epidemiologists have pretty much fallen into line with numbers like that. If you adjust for population, that would be equivalent to 220 million to 440 million people today. So unfortunately, this virus, even the worst of the worst case scenarios, don't project anything like that kind of death toll, thank God. In the United States, there are about 675,000 dead.
And what would that project to? So that'd be a couple of million
About
today?
2 million.
Yeah.
2 million.
Wow. Okay, so one of the points that you that you make is this scientific transformation and the things that came out of the pandemic. So maybe just take us through kind of, it's hard to even think about what good could come of something this dire, but there were some things that came out of the pandemic that you think made a difference in science and in medicine and in policy around that were relevant. So maybe take us through some of the things that played out over the next couple of decades.
Well, just as today, the scientific community was tremendously motivated and energized to work on, trying to find some solutions. As a result, the tremendous progress was made. The number one, the definition of a virus, understanding the difference. That would have happened anyway eventually, but I think it happened sooner rather than later. Number two, Avery's discovery, we've already discussed that DNA carries a genetic code. DNA was identified in 1868, but nobody knew what it did. At the time Avery was pursuing his work, the overwhelming view of geneticists was that proteins had to be the DNA was just way too simple a molecule to be involved in that. But again, Avery published that paper in 1944, and it was still a very minority view. You can read Jim Watson's Double Helix about that. He sort of laughs at the consensus view that Avery was wrong among people studying genes. But he and Crick, latched onto that, so did some others. But just medical science in general got a huge boost, I think, in scientific medicine. What had already started was accelerated in terms of medical education and everything else.
Yeah, I remember you also made the point that the WHO and maybe I don't know where the CDC came, but the idea of having epidemiologists to count cases and be sort of more transparent and have real-time information about what's going on, that got a boost at the time.
There were some, pioneer epidemiologists, Frost, for one, and George Soper, who later became the first head of the American Cancer Society and did the first epidemiological research on cancer and so forth. They were in the Army, like most scientists, did very good work. And just everything to do with science got a boost. Yeah. As a general rule, war is good for science, right. Unfortunately. Right. In this case, a pandemic was, science went to war against a pandemic and turned out to be pretty good for science. Yeah.
So I imagine you wrote that it took you 7 years to write the book. During the time, you must have thought about, could this happen again? And if it happened again, would the response be the same, or would we, would we make the same mistakes, or would we be better? Yeah. So tell me sort of how you fantasized about it, and now what you're feeling as you watch this thing roll through the world.
Well, I don't know that I fantasized about it, but anyone who understood anything about infectious disease and pandemics recognized that there would be another influenza pandemic and another one after that and another one after that. It's the nature of the virus. And of course, the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, H5N1 surfaces, N1 first in 97 and then when it resurfaced in the early 2000s, European countries and the United States started investing a lot of effort into preparing for a pandemic. As I said earlier, I was part of conceptualizing non-pharmaceutical interventions in the Bush administration, sort of been involved in pandemic preparedness to a certain extent ever since. I think Tom Frieden, when he left CDC, was asked what nightmare scenario, what kept him up at night, and he says influenza, it's always a worst case scenario. I mean, and maybe it would be. COVID-19 ain't so great.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have at least so far, we're not seeing the potential lethality that you might get from an influenza pandemic, but there are other viruses out there that might be easily transmissible as COVID-19 is, and more lethal, which would be not pleasant. I think the number one lesson, going back to those preparedness meetings that I participated in, the number one lesson that came out in 1918 was to tell the truth. In every meeting I ever participated in, I pushed that. I never got anyone arguing with me. The federal preparedness plan incorporates that idea of transparency at the very, very top of the plan. Every one of the 50 state plans says the same thing. The problem is you have to have someone who will execute the plan. And this time around, unfortunately, we did not have anyone who would execute the plan.
One of the things that struck me, though, it always feels very specific, who the leader is and the government is, and yet there were echoes of some of the mistakes from 18, sort of the happy talk and the let's protect people from the truth and debates about masks and things like that. I mean, I guess I tend to think a lot of this is very specific to the moment and who happens to be president, and yet there's probably some general truths there about the way people in power handle things like this, at least some.
I tend to quote Hegel, who said, what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. As opposed to the better known quote, those who learn from the poet faster condemned to repeat it.
There's a quote in your book that I particularly like. So here we are in San Francisco, and San Francisco, as you know, has been both lucky and good. Had a grand total of 48 deaths in the city so far. We may be seeing the early part of a little bit of a surge now. So we're not out of the woods, but we have been, and UCSF has been very, very transparent, very open. I think, and that's been true throughout the state and certainly the Bay Area. And you wrote, San Francisco was a rare exception. Its leaders told the truth, and the city responded heroically. What do you think that was about?
It could be the accident of leadership. It could have been something, to do with the earthquake, which was, a decade earlier. And San Francisco did not have a good experience. They were, fifth or sixth in terms of excess mortality in the country. So they were hit very hard. But the mayor and the business community and labor leaders all signed, and the medical leadership all signed a joint statement, ran in huge type in the newspaper, wear a mask and save your life. And I don't think the masks were effective, but that was a much stronger, much different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name.
Yeah.
So trust in San Francisco did not disintegrate. And the community function. In other cities, you literally had people starving to death, not just in cities, but in rural communities also. People starving to death because no one had the courage to bring them food. Or in Philadelphia, you had calls for volunteers that went unanswered and repeatedly. But in San Francisco, when they closed schools, teachers volunteered as everything is from telephone operators to ambulance drivers, which is certainly a high risk thing to volunteer for. So San Francisco functioned. And the difference was that it met the challenge as a community trying to come together, which is what happens in most communities in a disaster. You know, I'm here in New Orleans. You know, after Katrina, the city definitely, you know, tried to come together and did. It was people trying to help each other. And that's standard behavior in most disasters, I think. But when people are lied to, it almost forces them upon their own resources, forces them, you know, every family for itself, as opposed to helping each other. And in San Francisco, telling the truth, telling everyone they are facing this deadly threat, people did come together. And it would be great if we had some leadership today nationally, but we don't.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely feels that way here. Not perfect, but certainly better than what we see in many other places. Just a couple more questions. They didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Zoom, they didn't have Netflix. How does the technological moment that we find ourselves in influence the way it's playing out? You know, are these just sort of marginal differences, or as you think about what 1918 might have been like with some of the technology, do you think it would have been fundamentally different?
Well, you know, obviously there would have been differences. I think there would have been more communication between, you know, health commissioners across the country, for example. Although there was some, they did have telephones, they did have the telegraph, so you did have instantaneous communication. That was not widely shared, but certainly, you know, at some level that occurred. You had rumor, which was one of the reasons why telling the truth, when you've got symptoms such as a cyanosis described earlier that spreads rumors of, you know, the Black Death, it would be helpful if people were telling the truth. And, you know, now we have conspiracy theories. The government in 1918, actually, some official organs did promote the idea that this was bioterrorism, germ warfare, you know, Germans, germ warfare. You know, there was this campaign against Bayer aspirin, that Bayer aspirin carried influenza and so forth. You know, I don't, you know, there's no quantitative studies to figure out how many people spread this and how many people believed it. You know, as Goethe said, you know, you search where there is light. There's not a lot of light for any quantitative data. You know, how do you figure it? You read somebody's letter that refers to something like that, or you see a newspaper comment or ad or something. You know, how do you weigh that in terms of how many people believe that? You don't know. There wasn't any polling, so it's really hard to reach a solid conclusion on that. But
it is remarkable how the current mechanisms both allow the spread of information and the spread of misinformation at the speed of light. It would have been harder than to do both.
Well, rumor spreads pretty fast.
Yeah.
No.
I guess that's right. We're all sitting here hoping to get our lives back to normal and thinking that the only way out of this is a vaccine. There was no vaccine at the end of the pandemic, so how did they get out of it?
Well, I would say two ways. Number one, the immune systems, second, third time around, I think we're probably better at dealing with the virus. It's clear there was cross protection from earlier influenza viruses, which is why in the developed world, the case mortality was lower than in the less developed world. I mean, in some places that were virgin populations, you had 20 and 30% of the entire population being killed. And, you know, as I said earlier, I think I demonstrated in a, article in JID that first wave provided immunity against the second wave. There was a third wave in interestingly, and neither first nor second wave exposure protected against a third wave. So the virus mutated enough that that occurred. Nonetheless, immune systems were better able to deal with it. You didn't get the cytokine storms, and probably, I can't prove it, and I don't know, but it's one of the fastest mutating viruses in existence, as you know. My guess is the virus itself probably mutated toward mildness. So, 1920 was not a great, and one of the very unusual things about the 1918 virus is in the same influenza season, you had two waves. In the beginning in September through December, and then again in the late winter and early spring of 1919, February, March, you had another wave. Later, the 1919-1920 influenza season was not that bad, but 1920 was pretty bad, the 1920-21 season. And then it seemed to die out. 1928, there was a bad year for seasonal influenza. And actually, NIH was not founded until that reminder to the Congress that maybe we ought to do something. And NIH was then created after the 1928 bad year. I wouldn't call it a resurgence of the pandemic. But, that's speculation on my part. I can't prove any of that.
Yeah. So maybe last question. We will get through this somehow, maybe with a vaccine, some other mechanism. I assume there's some period afterwards where people come together, vow to tell the truth, pull out, create pandemic plans, build institutions, all of that kind of good stuff. Do you think that will happen? And if so, what are the lessons from 1918 about how well it will work and how long it will last?
Well, outside of the medical community, and particularly medical research, I don't, in the public health community, yeah, that happened. But in terms of penetrating the government, I'm not so sure it occurred until H5N1. Well, that's not dark. In 1976, you had the fear of swine flu. You had the Fort Dix episode. I can't remember if it was one or two soldiers died and never escaped Fort Dix. But you had the fiasco with that vaccine. So you did have concerns. But it wasn't really, and again, CDC, they were always concerned about influenza. So I'm only speaking about outside the public health community and the medical community. I want to be clear on that. But other than that, outside of the professionals, I don't think it was until the Bush administration that the really got seriously addressed outside the public health community.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Tommy Thompson, Bush's first HHS secretary, was in a meeting on pandemic influenza on September 11, 2001. So he was interested in it from the very beginning. And that's really prior to, at least to the resurfacing of H5N1. And he's so concerned about pandemic influenza, he basically had to be pulled reluctantly out of that meeting on September 11th.
Wow.
So he took it pretty seriously.
Yeah.
And indirectly, I think that led to the rest of the Bush administration taking it seriously, although that legislation, $7 billion bill, didn't occur until Mike Leavitt was secretary. And I know Mike Leavitt took it very, very seriously and sold it not only to Bush, but to went and visited every other cabinet secretary except for Rumsfeld to get them all signed on.
Well, let's go ahead and quit. Let's hope that we learn some lessons from this one. I can tell you I learned a ton of lessons from reading the book, and I really appreciate the work you did in putting it together and taking the time to educate us about this. If people haven't read the book, I strongly recommend it. It's terrific and eye-opening, and you realize there are certainly things that happened before that we need to learn from, and hopefully we will. So, John, thank you so much for being with us today. Really, really grateful.
Well, thank you, and I certainly enjoy what watching all the videos that I
Great.
get.
Thanks so much.
UCSF.
Let me thank our production team for putting this together as usual, and tell you we're going to take next week off after about 3 months of this, and we'll come back the week after for another grand rounds, and I believe that there will be plenty for us to talk about. It seems like, unfortunately, things are still pretty hot. So stay safe out there, and see you back again in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.